today from UKHSA.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Katy Turner. I'm based at the UKHSA. I'm also the UKHSA lead for the Health Protection Research Unit in Evaluation and Behavioural Science, which is based at the University of Bristol. And I also wanted to say, if there are areas that you would want to speak to colleagues at UKHSA about that you've been discussing this week, I'm really happy to have a chat and make any connections with other colleagues. That would be really happy to do that. Okay. So this is very much my first love. So my PhD was on gonorrhea and chlamydia modelling, and I wanted to, just sort of give you a bit of a flavour of why it's important to include behaviour in models and how we might do it, but also to give you a bit of some of the context around sexually transmitted infections in particular, and why that might be more difficult, or some of the specific challenges in including sexual behaviour in models. But I think there are also sort of crossovers or areas that we've already been discussing around, health inequalities and heterogeneity that are, could be applied in other areas as well. But I thought I'd ask a question first. So who here has ever had a cold? Okay, most people. Who knows someone who's had a cold? Yeah, pretty happy. So who here has had chlamydia? Oh, nobody. Interesting. Who knows someone who's had chlamydia? Maybe. Oh, okay. But probably not going to tell us. Don't know. Maybe. Yeah. Right. Okay. So this is one of the key reasons why STDs and the behaviour associated with sort of modelling STDs and STIs, I should say, is a bit of a challenge, because we don't directly observe it. There's also a lot of shame, stigma, social pressures associated with this. So just keep that in mind as we're going through some of the rest of the talk. So I know you're all mathematicians. We're here talking about epidemiology and as well as other aspects. So I know that you know what the R0 is. And when we're thinking about STIs and the behaviour, we tend to typically, are you letting people in? Yes, okay, don't need to worry about that. Good. We tend to split out transmission probability and contact rate into two separate parameters. Sometimes they get combined for other types of models. And really in this talk, we're thinking about the contact rate for infection and for transmission. So we're really thinking about that C part. And if we think about sort of contacts around for sexual contacts, we typically see a pattern where most people actually don't have very many contacts at all. They maybe have a partnership with one person, and some people have many partners. We have this variability. The second part is that if we look at person number one, they've got quite a few contacts. They're also in quite a connected part of the network, linked to another group of people. But from the perspective of little green people here, all the green people just have one partner. They just have one contact. But you can see the ones that are in these little duos down here, their risk might be very different than the people connected into that larger component. So one of the key things as well for STIs is really that the risk for an individual is not just based on your own behaviour, it's also based on your position within the network and what your partners might be doing. And in a way that maybe is more, or less observable perhaps than for some other infections. So you might know what your household contacts do in terms of their jobs or their professions or their contact patterns where they go to school, but you might not know what your partner is doing from a sexual perspective. So that's about kind of preferences, what people might want to be doing in terms of sexual behaviour. there's also an element of opportunity. So people who live in very rural locations might have less opportunity than if you're at an Ibiza nightclub for making sexual connections. And so this is where we get a sort of a flavour of the overall contact patterns, the overall sexual network that we think about depends both on individual preferences, but also the sort of availability and preferences of people around them as well. So yeah, so we have this, preferences, we have opportunity, we also have heterogeneity in behaviour. And we see this heterogeneity in behaviour and partner choice play through into the epidemiology that we see in the infections themselves. So we might have quite strong age preferences within sexual networks. And so for chlamydia, this plays out. So we have a sort of profile of age where the peak age of infection is around 20 for women, a little bit older for men. And if we think about a sort of fairly sort of average behaviours across the population in a heterosexual network, that also reflects the sort of age structure of sexual contacts, where women typically have partners who are a little bit older, and sexual debuts around the age of 15 or so. And then it declines with age as well. But we also see slightly different patterns if we look at something like gonorrhea. So if the dotted line is women, and we get very similar pattern of age profile for gonorrhea for women as we do for chlamydia, but the profile for men is quite different, and it extends into much older age groups. And the y-axes are different as well. So the chlamydia is much more prevalent than gonorrhea, so the much fewer cases. And about half of the cases in men occur in men who have sex with men, and about half the cases are in heterosexuals. So we get a slightly different age profile of cases for gonorrhea, reflecting a sort of more of a core group structure. And similarly, we can see differences by ethnic group. And again, this really reflects more about opportunity and positions in network than necessarily massive differences in behaviour. And this is really important when we're thinking about interventions and also stigma associated with infections with STIs. And we also get a lot of variation by geography. So some of the inner city areas have much higher rates of infections than in more rural areas. So as we said, the sort of connectedness and density of the sexual networks as well has an impact. And so we see both heterogeneity in behaviour, but also in the sort of social constructs around STIs that make it quite difficult to accurately model infection. So yeah, so just to summarise that, so we have the sort of the C part of our naught, which is around sexual partners and the rate of sexual partner change, which kind of depends on preferences around age, gender, frequency, types of behaviours, a little bit around opportunity. We also have this sort of idea of assortativity, so people of similar ages have sexual partners of similar ages, and we also have this idea of core groups where infection is kind of concentrated within specific groups. I've mentioned already the social factors around this, so yeah, you are much less inclined to tell me in public about your experiences with chlamydia than for other infections. And there's also elements of social desirability. There's also really important aspects around choice and health inequalities and power dynamics, particularly thinking about sex in exchange for money and drugs. And so people's choices in terms of their sexual behaviour aren't always fully their own. And so all of this gives rise to a sort of contact tract structure for transmission. And so I wanted to move on to how we actually incorporate that structure and that sexual behaviour into models. And so there's a number of different ways we can do that, and sort of roughly ranging from more simplistic to more complex, although there's some very complex ODE models and some quite simplistic network models, so it's not fully it's not quite so straightforward, but as a way of thinking about this. So we might have ordinary differential equation models. We might think about including risk groups, so age groups or gender, different genders, and then we describe the mixing patterns between those populations, and we can get some quite reasonable model outputs that look particularly for diseases which are sort of endemic or a reasonable prevalence within the population. We might also want to look at pair models, so that more explicitly incorporate partnership forming and breaking and contact tracing. And then we might move into sort of more network-based models, which explicitly model that sort of contact pattern, and maybe individual-based or may still be population-based. And then finally, we might have dynamic networks where those partnerships actively break and form over time. Which is getting closer to kind of the real life, if you like, of how partnerships form and break. And I think this applies to any kind of modelling that you're trying to do, but the model that is appropriate depends on what question you're trying to answer. So there might be situations where it could be really simple, and there might be situations where you really want to try and incorporate as much of the complexity and the real world variability as you can to answer the question. But yeah, I think if you take nothing else away, if you don't know what the question is that you're trying to model, don't do a model. I'm just going to go into a couple of examples where we've used some what I think are quite cool modelling approaches to incorporate sexual behaviour within some mathematical models to answer some specific questions. So one of the examples I'm going to pull out is around antimicrobial resistance and using point of care diagnostics, and some of the questions we wanted to look at for that. If I have time, I might also touch on partner notification, which was actually a very simple model that we looked at as well. But I'll start with the AMR one, because I think this is quite a cool example where we've used developed a bit of a novel approach to modelling behaviour. So this started out from some work that we were asked to do as part of the O'Neill review, which was trying to look at what's the potential of point of care tests to enable individualised treatment of infections for antimicrobial resistant gonorrhea. And the reason for this is that the current guidance is to use ceftriaxone, which is basically last line treatment for the treatment of gonorrhea. But actually there's other treatments available, and most of the infections that we have would actually be susceptible to those other treatments, but we take a very precautionary approach and try to use something that basically everything is susceptible to. But if we had better tests, maybe we could improve that, those options. And so the first piece of work we did for O'Neill review was a static model, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore because there's not a lot of behaviour in it at all. But we were able to use quite a simple model to start to look at, okay, what would this need to cost? What are the benefits? What might be the implications from a sort of service provision perspective if we did have these tests? But we didn't really include modelling. And one of the things we wanted to do was to actually incorporate behaviour a bit more explicitly. So the second piece of work and the model that I'm going to go into a bit more detail was trying to include an explicit sexual network model of gonorrhea transmission in men who have sex with men, and incorporate some of the findings from this other work around what if we had a point of care test. And we were interested in two parts. So what if we have a point of care test that we can use to help direct treatment, so to select between 2 different antibiotics. And then what if we also use that information from our index case to inform treatment for their partners? So if your partner had a resistant strain, we would treat your infection as if it's resistant. If they had a sensitive strain, we treat you as if you're sensitive without having to necessarily do the testing. And so we developed a SIS model. This is actually quite old now, but it's still, I think, quite cool. And we have a fully explicit contact network of all the possible contacts, of a sexual network, a scale-free sexual network. We had 2 strains of antibiotics, or 2 strains of gonorrhea, one of which is susceptible to ciprofloxacin and one of which is resistant, and would therefore need treating with ceftriaxone. And we modelled this using, we had a couple of options. So we have previously used a fully dynamic model where all partnerships are explicitly described and form and break over time. But what we did in this case was to develop a sort of heuristic model where we describe the full network of all the possible contacts that can happen over time as a scale-free power law network with just 2 parameters. So there's like the maximum number of partners that someone can have within the model at any one time, and then a parameter that describes the distribution of partnerships within the model, and then an update frequency. So there's a time step of how long those partnerships are active for over time. And we can vary that between basically a daily change in partnerships up to no change in partnerships at all, which would basically recreate the static model. And yeah, these sort of partial networks eventually converge on the full annual template of what we've described. And the advantages of this approach is that you have a very well-defined starting network. So running the model is actually quite efficient, but we get the benefits because this sort of slows down the transmission probability, because transmission can only happen on between active partnerships. We get more realistic transmission dynamics essentially, and so we get arguably the best of both worlds in terms of having quite a reproducible and tractable model compared to some of the other fully dynamic models, which need to be run lots of times and are actually quite slow. Maybe this is less of an issue now than it was in 2006, but yeah, you get quite a lot of control over what the network looks like, and you can vary this. So we did a bit of sort of model fitting to ensure that the model reproduced this kind of distribution of partnership numbers, so this degree distribution at the bottom, and fitted or compared that to some data on numbers of sexual partners from a UK survey. And then we were able to, because we had this nice fast model, essentially, we were able to look across quite a broad parameter space to try and fit to the infection dynamics. So we fitted to prevalence, varying transmission probability, and how restricted the maximum number of partners was. And we also looked at some other factors like the proportion who are symptomatic. And basically, we found that, yeah, using this model, we could estimate what the impacts over time were of treating based on either a direct AMR test result or just treating based on the partner result, and how much that was able to, whether that increased the spread of resistant strains or whether it was able to make treatment more rapid and preserve the use of ceftriaxone just for those cases that were resistant to ciprofloxacin. And I think, so one of the things that we've been discussing a bit today is really how do we include adaptive behaviour, so not just trying to model behaviour as a parameter, if you like, but actually how behaviour might change in response to interventions or to things happening within the environment. And again, that's something that's quite tricky. We know that people's sexual behaviour varies across their life course and can actually adapt quite rapidly. I mean, it's quite difficult to stop breathing, but it's relatively straightforward to change your sort of sexual behaviour over a short period of time. And I'm also going to touch on how we might exploit the sexual contact structure to help target control strategies. We also have changes in behaviour on an individual level. So you might change partners and then, break up, get together with someone new. There might be gaps, but there's also societal changes over time as well. So the sort of cultural and social norms. We see changes often in things like drug use or different kinds of sexual behaviour changing over time. That it might be important to include within models. And this is just one example. So this is looking kind of historically at gonorrhea diagnoses. And I want you to look at sort of around the late 80s, we see this sort of massive drop off in gonorrhea cases. And I don't know, you're quite young, but you probably would be still aware that this is really being driven by behavioural change within the population as a result of the HIV epidemic. So this is gonorrhea. This is not HIV. But it's a reflection that we see in the data of really massive changes in behaviour, both reducing sexual contact but also using condoms, and that has this knock-on impact on gonorrhea diagnoses. So it's just quite a nice example where we see the evidence of changing behaviour in some of this data. And in general, STIs tend to be quite low prevalence within the population, or a lot of the STIs that I've worked on are quite low prevalence within the population. So maybe, thinking about chlamydia, maybe 3%, something like that. But when you look at the partners of people with STIs, the prevalence is much higher. And we can use this through in terms of our control strategies. So in STIs, we use contact tracing a lot because the partners of someone with an STI are much more likely to have an STI than the general population. And so this is a really key part of STI control. And so, you can see if we pull out those three blue infected people from the population, they're more likely to be connected. And so, contact tracing is an efficient strategy. And I mentioned, that this was some, really unsophisticated modelling in an Excel spreadsheet, but really, and, slightly stating the obvious. But people who have partners with an STI, or people who are partners of someone with an STI, something like 10 times more likely than someone in the general population to also have an STI. And so, investing in partner notification is efficient and effective control strategy. And there's, a few other reasons why partner notification works. So these infections are often not symptomatic. They might be difficult to detect, so people don't know they're infected. They're quite often quite highly transmissible within a sexual partnership. So again, that increases the risk for the partner. So just to come a bit back to full circle, and how do we actually measure sexual behaviour for models, and what data might we draw on to inform the models? And this is a nice piece of work done by my colleague Dana, reviewing the different types of data sources that we have available. So thinking about our national surveillance data, data from reproductive health systems, primary and secondary care, census registries and administrative data, and then population surveys and targeted surveys and other research data that all together can help us to integrate and calibrate the data to inform our models and our structures, particularly around sexual behaviour. And so this is a nice example where she's sort of put together these different types of data and how they might inform us about progress towards HIV elimination targets. NatSal is a survey of sexual attitudes and lifestyles, and that can give us some information about the people who aren't accessing services and who we don't see at all in the data. There's some examples of some targeted surveys to collect data on smaller groups of the population who maybe have a disproportionate burden of disease and impact on transmission. We have some national surveillance data, so in particular we have some HIV specific data sources and also the sort of national data on STI surveillance that gives us information about testing and what's going on within the services, so people who are accessing care and testing. We might also have data from like CPRD or HES data, and then we also have census data that kind of gives us some denominators for populations of interest. But for STIs, we don't really have all of this in one place, so we have to kind of integrate and look at different elements of these data to really inform the models and inform intervention development. So we've covered, I think, some of the challenges in integrating behaviour and integrating particularly sexual behaviour into models. So sexual behaviour changes and adapts. Most people have few partners and a few have many. The sexual contact matrix is highly structured, but also very dynamic. And yes, different models can address different research questions. I've given a few examples of that. But the actual behaviour itself is not really observed directly. And so it can be difficult to measure, and so we tend to need to integrate different sources of data to accurately interpret what we're seeing in the data. And yeah, social and cultural norms influence transmission and uptake of interventions. So things like access to care, trust in systems, and uptake of interventions like vaccination or pre-exposure prophylaxis might vary according to different population groups, and also who thinks they're at risk. Some of the future challenges that I think this team and this workshop can think about, which I think also applies to some of the other examples that you've been working on and thinking about. So how do we model behaviour and not in a slightly more adaptive way, and allowing actors within the model to respond or have preferences around their behaviour, not just be sort of mindless agents within the model? What level of that behaviour is necessary and realistic for models? And can we actually predict behavioural responses to interventions or to other circumstances? So I guess that's what you're trying to do with thinking about last year's experience, and certainly we've really seen that with MPOX, where people have already had experiences with different STIs and maybe respond in different ways and more quickly than we might expect. So thank you.